before the timelines were analyzed, before the debates split into opposing camps, before her name became a symbol rather than a person. There's only a face that appeared ordinary, calm, unremarkable, the kind of face people pass in grocery stores, classrooms, offices, without ever imagining it would one day become the center of a national conversation. And yet, over time, that face would divide opinions more sharply than many visible acts ever could. For Karla Homolka, public memory did not begin with events. It began with perception. When images first circulated across television screens and newspaper pages, the reaction was immediate, not because of what people knew, but because of what they felt. The human mind is wired to form impressions before facts arrive. Within seconds of seeing a face, the brain begins constructing narratives, trustworthy or deceptive, vulnerable or calculating, sympathetic or distant. These judgments do not wait for evidence. They precede it, and once formed, they are remarkably difficult to dissolve. Photographs freeze a single second and stretch it into permanence. A neutral expression becomes a statement. A composed posture becomes a personality trait. The public rarely recognizes how much interpretation occurs in silence. When viewers look at a still image, they're not only seeing the subject, they're seeing themselves reflected back through expectation. Some saw restraint and interpreted shock. Others saw the same restraint and interpreted strategy. The image did not change. The observer did. This is the psychological power of first impressions. They are not conclusions. They are anchors. Once anchored, every new piece of information attaches itself to that initial perception. Headlines may add details. Analysts may provide context. But the mind quietly returns to the first image it accepted as truth. That image becomes the lens through which everything else is filtered. In this way, the story did not begin with crime. It began with cognition. Society often believes it judges events rationally, yet perception is emotional long before it is logical. A calm face unsettles some viewers more than visible distress would. Emotional neutrality, when it appears where intensity is expected, creates friction. The brain, uncomfortable with ambiguity, rushes to resolve the tension by assigning intention. An intention, once assigned, becomes identity. As media repetition intensified, the face transformed into a symbol. No longer just a person, but a projection surface. Talk shows debated expressions. Articles dissected posture. Viewers paused footage, searching for clues hidden in milliseconds. The public was not merely observing a legal narrative. It was participating in a collective psychological exercise, the attempt to decode morality through appearance. But appearance is an imperfect language. A steady gaze can signify composure, fear, or emotional containment. A lowered head can signify shame, exhaustion, or concentration. A slight smile can signify politeness, discomfort, or reflex. Yet when a nation looks at the same image simultaneously, these possibilities collapse into polarized certainty. The conversation shifts from what do we know to what do we believe, and belief travels faster than fact ever can. The face became a dividing line, not because it revealed everything, but because it revealed nothing conclusively. And in that absence of certainty, the public mind did what it has always done when confronted with ambiguity. It filled the silence with interpretation. Each interpretation felt justified. Each conclusion felt intuitive. But intuition is shaped by culture, expectation, and personal experience far more than by objective evidence. What began as observation evolved into identity assignment. What began as a photograph evolved into a narrative. This prologue is not about guilt or innocence. It is about perception, the silent force that shapes judgment before the first word is spoken. It is about how a single image can divide a nation, not because it contains truth, but because it contains possibility. And possibility, when viewed through millions of minds at once, becomes a battlefield of interpretation. In the chapters that follow, we do not simply examine actions. We examine the psychology of seeing, believing, and remembering. Because sometimes the most powerful event in a story is not what happened, but what people thought they saw before they understood anything at all. Long before the cameras, before the courtroom benches filled with spectators, before her name carried the weight of controversy, Karla Homolka existed within the category most human beings pass through their entire lives without ever questioning: the category of ordinary. Ordinary is not an absence of identity. It is an identity that does not demand attention. In old photographs, the kind that sit quietly in albums until history gives them new meaning, she appears relaxed among friends, standing in the familiar geometry of youth, shoulders angled slightly inward, smiles unguarded, eyes directed toward a future that had not yet assigned her a role. At the time those images were taken, no one studied them. No one zoomed into expressions searching for hidden clues. They were snapshots of routine, and routine rarely invites analysis. But routine has a psychological architecture. People later described her as approachable, cooperative, and socially fluid, the type of presence that enters a room without shifting its atmosphere. She was not remembered as confrontational or volatile. Instead, she was remembered as agreeable. Agreement is often praised in social environments. It smooths conversations, reduces friction, and builds acceptance. Yet beneath agreement lies a subtle psychological mechanism: the association between harmony and emotional safety. When a person grows accustomed to positive reinforcement for adaptability, the brain begins to equate approval with stability. This does not erase individuality. It shifts the center of gravity. Decisions become quietly calibrated against reactions. Words are weighed not only for meaning, but for impact. Over time, a pattern forms, not visible from the outside, but deeply influential from within. In school corridors and casual gatherings, she blended rather than dominated. Teachers remembered attentiveness. Peers remembered politeness. These recollections carry no warning, only normalcy. And it is precisely this normalcy that unsettled the public years later. Society prefers linear stories with visible warning signs, early fractures, dramatic origins. When none are present, hindsight begins to search for explanations that were never there. The truth, however, is less cinematic and more human. Personality rarely changes through sudden revelation. It evolves through repetition. Small choices accumulate. Small compromises become habits. Habits shape perception, and perception shapes identity. None of this announces itself. It happens quietly, beneath the threshold of conscious awareness, like architecture built stone by stone until a structure stands where empty space once existed. At this early stage, there was no public narrative, no psychological label, no debate. There is only a young woman moving through ordinary routines, surrounded by people who had no reason to question the stability of the image before them. The absence of alarm was not negligence. It was human nature. We do not scrutinize what aligns with expectation. We scrutinize what disrupts it. And because nothing yet disrupted expectation, nothing drew attention. But later, when history re-examined these moments, the stillness itself became suspicious. Photographs that once represented innocence became artifacts of contradiction. The mind, uncomfortable with unpredictability, searched those images again and again, convinced that danger must have left visible fingerprints. Yet faces do not always reveal future actions. Expressions do not forecast moral conflict. Identity does not always wear its complexity on the surface. The unsettling realization was not that something had been hidden. It was that nothing had appeared unusual at all. And when normalcy becomes the prelude to controversy, society confronts a truth it rarely wants to acknowledge: that the line between the ordinary and the extraordinary is thinner than anyone feels comfortable admitting. The turning points in psychological narratives rarely arrive with thunder. They do not announce themselves with dramatic confrontations or sudden revelations. They enter quietly, disguised as connection, affection, and the universal human desire to be understood. When Paul Bernardo became part of Karla Homolka's life, the beginning did not carry the weight it would later hold in public memory. It looked like many relationships do in their earliest stages. Two individuals discovering familiarity in each other's presence, sharing laughter that felt spontaneous rather than forced, exchanging attention that seemed mutual rather than calculated. Friends observed proximity. Photographs captured mirrored smiles. The social language surrounding them was simple. They looked happy. And happiness rarely triggers suspicion. The early interactions unfolded in ordinary spaces, casual gatherings, everyday conversations, moments that passed without ceremony. There were no visible ruptures, no dramatic disagreements that would later stand as warning signs. What existed instead was a gradual intertwining of routines. Phone calls became longer. Weekends became shared. The rhythm of daily life began to adjust, not through declaration, but through repetition. Psychologically, this stage carries a quiet power. Attachment does not only change schedules, it changes perception. When emotional connection intensifies, the brain begins to prioritize relational harmony. Chemicals associated with bonding and reward create a subtle reinforcement loop. Attention from one person becomes emotionally significant. Approval becomes reassuring. Disapproval becomes heavier than it once felt. None of these shifts are inherently dangerous. They are part of human intimacy. But they also introduce a new center of gravity. Observers later described changes that were not dramatic, only gradual. A softer tone when disagreements surfaced. A quicker willingness to apologize even when conflict was mutual. A growing preference for peace over friction. These behaviors, in isolation, are often praised as maturity or emotional intelligence. Society rewards those who smooth tension rather than escalate it. Yet beneath this surface lies a psychological negotiation that rarely receives attention while it is happening. Each preserved harmony teaches the mind that avoidance reduces discomfort. Each compromise feels small, temporary, and reasonable. But small negotiations accumulate. Over weeks and months, routines began to align. Invitations were accepted or declined with consideration of another person's schedule. Conversations subtly shifted from "I plan" to "we plan." These are not dramatic declarations of dependence. They are incremental adjustments that feel natural because they are socially reinforced. No one around them sounded an alarm because there was no visible alarm to sound. What many fail to notice in relationships is that identity rarely dissolves. It relocates. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as identity merging, but the phrase can imply a loss that is not always present. It is more accurate to view it as identity re-anchoring. The internal compass does not disappear. It begins to reference another person's reactions as part of its calibration. The question inside the mind shifts almost imperceptibly from "what do I want?" to "what preserves stability?" The individual does not feel controlled. They feel committed. And commitment is one of the most socially celebrated traits in romantic partnerships. But commitment has a psychological shadow. It can narrow perspective without announcing that it has done so. As emotional gravity strengthens, hesitation becomes quieter. Doubts are postponed rather than confronted. Conflict is delayed in favor of short-term peace. These choices rarely feel like sacrifices in the moment. They feel like investments in harmony. Only later, when observers reconstruct the timeline, do these incremental shifts appear significant. From the outside, the relationship maintained a familiar appearance. Shared laughter, synchronized gestures, the subtle choreography couples often develop without realizing it. From the inside, however, the emotional stakes grew heavier. Decisions began carrying implications they once did not. Words were weighed more carefully. Silence lingered longer before disagreement surfaced. The internal dialogue did not vanish. It negotiated. Influence does not usually announce itself. It adjusts volume. One internal voice becomes louder because it promises stability. Another becomes softer because it introduces tension. Over time, The louder voice feels like intuition, while the softer voice feels like doubt. The person experiencing this shift does not perceive it as transformation. It feels like adaptation, the natural adjustment people make when forming deep emotional bonds. Friends who later reflected on this period rarely described abrupt change. Instead, they spoke of subtle differences, a slightly altered tone, a new rhythm of availability, a sense that priorities had rearranged themselves without explicit decision. These recollections, gathered after the fact, carried the clarity of hindsight. But in real time, the changes were nearly invisible. This is the psychological complexity of relational gravity. It does not force decisions. It reorganizes importance. And when importance reorganizes quietly, identity follows without fanfare. The relationship did not erupt into prominence. It settled into daily life, becoming part of its structure. No dramatic scenes, no visible fractures. Only the slow weaving of two emotional trajectories into a shared path that, at the time, appeared entirely ordinary. It is this ordinariness that later unsettled observers. Not because it concealed something obvious, but because it concealed nothing at all. Quiet shifts are the ones society overlooks most easily. They do not disrupt expectation. They blend into it. Only when later events cast a new light do these moments become focal points, examined frame by frame, as if clarity could be retroactively discovered. But clarity rarely lives in the beginning. It emerges only after the center has already moved. There is a moment in many psychological narratives when the outside world continues unchanged, while the inside world begins to rearrange itself. This moment rarely has a date. It rarely has witnesses. And yet, it becomes one of the most important turning points in retrospect. For Karla Homolka, public life maintained a smooth surface. Social interactions did not suddenly fracture. Conversations did not become visibly strained. Photographs from gatherings still showed relaxed posture and familiar smiles. To acquaintances, nothing appeared dramatically different. The image presented to the world remained consistent. Approachable, composed, socially functional. But consistency can sometimes conceal complexity rather than reflect stability. Human beings possess a cognitive skill that allows them to function in daily environments while managing internal conflict. Psychologists refer to this as compartmentalization, the mind's ability to separate emotional realities so they do not collide all at once. It is not inherently deceptive. It is often protective. People use it constantly. Professionals compartmentalize personal grief to complete tasks. Caregivers compartmentalize exhaustion to remain supportive. Students compartmentalize anxiety to sit through examinations. In most lives, compartmentalization is a survival tool. In more complex narratives, it becomes a dividing line between outward appearance and inward tension. Observers later described Karla's demeanor as calm, even controlled, in social spaces. What they did not see, and what cameras rarely capture, is the mental labor involved in maintaining equilibrium when emotional stakes are rising. The human brain is capable of filtering expression with remarkable precision. Facial muscles relax, even when thoughts accelerate. Tone remains, even while internal dialogue becomes crowded. The absence of visible distress does not always indicate the absence of distress. It often indicates the presence of regulation. Regulation, however, is easily misinterpreted. In group settings, subtle cues began to shift. A delayed response where once there had been immediacy. A momentary withdrawal from conversation before re-engaging. These changes were small, almost imperceptible, but they marked the early stages of a private divide. The separation between what was felt and what was displayed. No one labeled it at the time. Social environments reward composure, not transparency. A calm exterior is praised. Internal complexity is rarely visible enough to invite concern. This is the paradox of emotional filtering. The more skilled a person becomes at maintaining external balance, the less likely others are to notice internal conflict. The divide did not form through sudden events. It formed through repetition, the quiet habit of postponing discomfort, the learned reflex of smoothing tension before it surfaced. Each instance reinforced the idea that emotional containment preserved social stability. Over time, the habit became automatic. The smile that appeared in photographs was not necessarily false. It was selective. It revealed one layer while concealing another, not out of malice, but out of adaptation. Public perception often equates visible emotion with honesty and emotional restraint with calculation. Yet the reality is more complex. Many individuals raised in environments that value composure learn early that visible distress invites scrutiny, while calmness invites acceptance. The lesson becomes internalized. Expression is moderated, reactions are filtered, and authenticity becomes segmented rather than erased. As months passed, the gap between public presentation and private processing widened. Not visibly, but psychologically. Conversations continued. Social routines persisted. Yet beneath the continuity lay an internal negotiation that few recognized. The mind, when confronted with conflicting priorities or emotional tension, seeks balance through separation rather than confrontation. It creates mental compartments, each holding a fragment of reality so the whole does not overwhelm. From the outside, nothing dramatic occurred. From the inside, complexity multiplied. The unsettling element of this stage is not secrecy. It is normalcy. Society expects internal conflict to announce itself through visible rupture, arguments, tears, withdrawal. When conflict remains contained, observers assume stability. This assumption reveals more about collective expectation than individual behavior. We are conditioned to equate stillness with peace, even though stillness can also signify restraint, fatigue, or the effort of emotional management. By the time hindsight cast its analytical light backward, the public smile became symbolic. It was interpreted as evidence by some, as coping by others. Yet at the time it appeared, it was simply part of social navigation. The same navigation millions perform daily without scrutiny. The difference lay not in the act of smiling, but in the meaning later assigned to it. The private divide did not manifest as visible fracture. It existed as layered awareness, the ability to hold multiple emotional realities without allowing them to collide in public view. And this is what unsettled observers in retrospect. Not that there was a smile, but that the smile revealed so little about the complexity beneath it. In public memory, decisions often appear as sharp lines, a moment before, a moment after. But in lived experience, decisions rarely arrive as singular events. They arrive as negotiations. For Karla Homolka, the stage that followed the growing private divide was not marked by visible confrontation or dramatic turning points. It was marked by something far less cinematic and far more psychologically common: incremental reasoning. The kind of reasoning that does not declare itself as change, but slowly adjusts the boundaries of what feels acceptable, tolerable, or unavoidable. Human beings seldom wake up with entirely new moral frameworks. They adapt them gradually. The mind has a remarkable capacity to reduce internal tension through reinterpretation. When discomfort surfaces, it searches for context that makes the discomfort smaller. It reframes, postpones, and rationalizes, not out of malice, but out of emotional self-preservation. This process is often invisible even to the person experiencing it. It does not feel like compromise. It feels like coping. In everyday life, this mechanism appears in small ways. A postponed apology, a justified omission, a rule bent just this once. These moments rarely define a person's character because their scale is limited. But the psychological engine behind them, the quiet negotiation between conscience and circumstance, is universal. What unsettles observers in larger narratives is not the existence of the mechanism, but its expansion under emotional pressure. Negotiation rarely sounds dramatic inside the mind. It sounds practical. It sounds temporary. It sounds reasonable. A hesitation becomes a delay. A delay becomes a reinterpretation. A reinterpretation becomes a new emotional baseline. None of these stages carry alarms. They are accompanied by language that softens impact. Just this once, it's not that severe, this will pass. These phrases do not always reach spoken form. They exist as emotional translations, reducing friction enough for the day to continue without collapse. The person does not perceive themselves as crossing a boundary. They perceive themselves as managing a situation. Observers, looking back with the clarity of hindsight, often compress these layered negotiations into singular judgments. They search for a decisive instant when everything changed. But psychological reality resists such compression. Change is rarely instantaneous. It accumulates through repetition, through small accommodations that feel harmless in isolation but significant in sequence. Another layer complicates these negotiations: emotional gravity. When relationships carry strong attachment, decisions are not evaluated in a vacuum. They are weighed against the perceived cost of disruption. Harmony becomes a stabilizer, and the instinct to preserve it can soften resistance to discomfort. This does not erase agency. It reframes priorities. The person still chooses, but the scale against which choices are measured has shifted. The mind, under sustained emotional pressure, also employs diffusion of responsibility, the quiet belief that accountability is shared or externalized. This belief does not always manifest as denial. It often appears as emotional distancing, the sense that outcomes are influenced by forces larger than individual control. In moderate circumstances, this distancing reduces anxiety. In complex narratives, it can blur clarity, making decisions feel less personal than they truly are. What makes this stage psychologically significant is not a single act. It is the rhythm of adjustment. Adjustment becomes routine. Routine becomes identity. Identity becomes the lens through which future choices are viewed. From the outside, little appears different. Conversations continue. Daily schedules remain intact. The person does not announce their internal negotiations because internal negotiations are rarely visible. Society tends to recognize change only when it produces external disruption. Quiet shifts pass unnoticed until later events cast them into sharp relief. The unsettling truth is that moral reasoning is not always a battlefield. Often, it is a series of quiet conversations with oneself. And quiet conversations rarely leave records. In retrospect, observers attempt to reconstruct these moments as if clarity had once been obvious. But clarity is often a product of distance. Within the moment, emotions, attachments, and fears coexist, creating a landscape where certainty feels elusive. The individual moves forward not with dramatic declarations, but with incremental steps that feel manageable at the time. The narrative of choice, therefore, is not a sudden pivot. It is a gradual tilt, and by the time the tilt becomes visible to the outside world, it has usually been felt internally for far longer than anyone realizes. There's a distinct psychological shift that occurs when private complexity is forced into public visibility. What once existed as internal dialogue becomes external scrutiny, and scrutiny changes the nature of everything it touches. For Karla Homolka, the transition from private life into public attention did not happen gradually. It happened like a door opening into bright light after a long period in shadow. The environment changed instantly. The expectations changed instantly. And with that change came a new psychological terrain, one shaped not by personal relationships or internal negotiations, but by collective observation. The first moments of public exposure carry a unique weight. The body registers it before the mind fully processes it. Shoulders tighten, breathing shifts, peripheral awareness expands. A person entering a space filled with observers does not merely walk into a room. They walk into a field of perception where every movement becomes meaningful whether they intend it to or not. In these situations, expression becomes filtered through necessity. Emotion is not always suppressed. It is managed. Management does not mean calculation. It often means survival. When confronted with overwhelming attention, many individuals instinctively narrow their emotional display to maintain composure. The face becomes neutral not because nothing is felt, but because too much is felt at once. The mind prioritizes stability over transparency, choosing control over collapse. But the public rarely interprets emotional containment this way. Observers tend to expect visible cues that match their internal narratives. If they anticipate remorse, they look for tears. If they anticipate guilt, they look for downward gazes or trembling hands. When these signals do not appear in expected forms, uncertainty emerges. And uncertainty is uncomfortable. The human mind resolves discomfort by assigning meaning, sometimes prematurely, sometimes inaccurately. This is where perception transforms into evidence in the court of public opinion. A steady posture becomes a sign of strength to some viewers and a sign of coldness to others. A calm tone becomes resilience in one interpretation and calculation in another. The same image travels across television screens and digital platforms, fragmenting into thousands of personal judgments. Each viewer believes they are seeing the truth, when in reality, they are seeing a reflection of their own expectations layered over limited visual data. The media environment amplifies this effect. Short clips loop repeatedly. Photographs freeze single seconds into permanent impressions. Context shrinks while interpretation expands. A neutral expression, repeated often enough, becomes a defining characteristic in public memory. Over time, the repetition shapes perception more strongly than the original moment ever could. Outside the spaces of official proceedings, conversations multiplied. People debated not only actions, but demeanor. Words like composed, controlled, and detached circulated widely, each carrying emotional undertones that influenced interpretation. These descriptors did not merely describe behavior. They shaped identity in the collective imagination. What the public rarely sees is the psychological toll of sustained observation. Continuous scrutiny alters self-awareness. Movements become deliberate. Speech becomes measured. Silence becomes strategic even when strategy is not intended. The individual adapts, not necessarily to deceive, but to endure. Endurance, however, can resemble performance when viewed through distant lenses. In these moments, the line between authenticity and perception blurs. Authenticity exists internally. Perception exists externally. The two do not always align. This misalignment does not imply manipulation. It reveals the limitations of visual judgment. Human beings are not static portraits. They are dynamic emotional systems responding to context. Yet public discourse often treats expression as static proof, forgetting that behavior under scrutiny is influenced by pressure as much as by personality. The psychological impact of this transition is profound. The private world, once governed by personal relationships and internal reasoning, becomes secondary. The new environment is governed by visibility. Visibility introduces a constant awareness of being seen, and that awareness reshapes how emotion is expressed. The individual learns quickly that every gesture can be replayed, every word quoted, every pause interpreted. In this landscape, silence speaks loudly. Stillness becomes narrative, and neutrality becomes controversial. The unsettling aspect of this stage is not simply the attention itself. It is the realization that once perception takes hold, it rarely releases its grip. Facts continue to emerge, timelines evolve, and legal processes move forward. But the first strong impression, the image formed in those early public moments, often remains fixed. It becomes the anchor around which later information is interpreted. This anchoring effect is not unique to this case. It is a universal feature of human cognition. The mind prefers continuity over revision because revision requires effort, and effort invites uncertainty. And uncertainty, more than anything else, is what society struggles to tolerate. Thus, the public eye does not merely observe. It constructs, it assigns, it remembers selectively. And once constructed, that memory becomes a parallel reality, one that can influence conversations, opinions, and emotional reactions long after the initial moment has passed. Once a story enters the media cycle, it stops belonging solely to the individuals involved. It becomes a shared narrative, edited, repeated, and reshaped until the original moments are almost indistinguishable from their retellings. For Karla Homolka, media exposure did not simply increase awareness. It altered the psychological landscape entirely. What had once been a sequence of events became a sequence of images, and images travel faster than context ever can. Headlines shortened complexity into phrases that fit within margins. Photographs replaced paragraphs. Tone replaced timeline. And in this transformation, identity itself became a subject of public construction. Television panels debated demeanor as if expression alone could resolve moral uncertainty. Newspaper columns dissected posture, clothing, and facial stillness with the precision of forensic analysis. The repetition was relentless. A single photograph could appear on multiple screens within the same hour, each time accompanied by commentary that layered interpretation over observation. Over days and weeks, repetition turned description into definition. The psychological mechanism at work here is availability bias, the tendency to judge reality based on the information most frequently encountered. When an image appears repeatedly, the brain begins to treat it as representative, even if it captures only a fraction of the person's emotional range. The public does not remember the entire sequence of events. It remembers the most circulated frame. Gender expectations amplified this effect. Cultural narratives often associate empathy and emotional openness with femininity. When a woman's demeanor appears restrained in high-pressure situations, the reaction intensifies because it collides with expectation. Some viewers instinctively interpreted composure as evidence of manipulation. Others interpreted it as emotional shock or learned restraint. The same visual cue generated opposing conclusions, each shaped by the observer's internal framework rather than by objective certainty. Media platforms also introduced speed into the narrative. Speed compresses nuance. In the rush to deliver updates, complexity becomes inconvenient. A calm expression is easier to describe than an evolving psychological state. Over time, the easier description prevails. The public becomes familiar with a simplified identity, not because it is accurate, but because it is repeatable. Outside studios and editorial offices, conversations multiplied. Cafes, living rooms, and online forums became extensions of the media mirror. People discussed not only the case, but the person, tone, posture, perceived intention. Opinions formed quickly, reinforced by repetition rather than reflection. Supporters and critics emerged, often aligned less by evidence than by emotional intuition. The story fractured into parallel interpretations, each one supported by selective attention. This stage reveals a critical psychological truth. Once identity becomes symbolic, it stops being singular. The individual becomes an idea, a representation onto which society projects fears, expectations, and unresolved questions. In this symbolic space, nuance struggles to survive. Symbols are powerful precisely because they are simple, and simplicity travels farther than complexity ever can. For the person at the center of such narratives, the psychological impact is profound. Visibility reshapes self-awareness. Every gesture becomes a potential headline. Silence becomes a statement. The instinct to regulate emotion intensifies, not necessarily to influence perception, but to endure it. Yet endurance itself can appear strategic when viewed through the distorting lens of repetition. The media mirror does not merely reflect. It echoes, and echoes grow louder with each repetition. Over time, The public memory of a person can diverge significantly from their lived experience. What remains in collective consciousness is not the full chronology, but the distilled impression, the expression most frequently seen, the descriptor most often repeated, the interpretation that felt emotionally satisfying. The mind, seeking coherence, weaves these fragments into a narrative that feels complete even when it is inherently partial. The unsettling aspect of this process is not that it occurs, it is that it occurs so naturally. Humans rely on narrative to make sense of complexity. Media accelerates that reliance, providing ready-made frameworks that reduce uncertainty. But frameworks can harden into assumptions, and assumptions can shape perception long after new information emerges. The first strong image becomes an anchor. Later details are interpreted around it rather than against it. Thus, the story expands beyond legal proceedings or personal psychology. It becomes a cultural artifact, a shared memory shaped as much by repetition as by reality. And once a narrative becomes cultural, it is no longer controlled by facts alone. As time passed and the immediate shock began to settle into analysis, the public conversation did not converge toward a single conclusion. It fractured. What emerged was not one story, but several, each supported by its own psychological logic, each sustained by the emotional needs of the people who believed in it. The narrative surrounding Karla Homolka evolved into three dominant interpretations, and these interpretations revealed as much about collective psychology as they did about the individual at the center. The first narrative framed her as a victim, someone emotionally influenced, psychologically constrained, and gradually shaped by relational pressure. Supporters of this perspective emphasize concepts such as emotional dependency and trauma bonding, arguing that prolonged exposure to a powerful personality can narrow perceived options until resistance feels psychologically impossible. In this interpretation, visible composure was not evidence of control, but evidence of emotional shock or learned restraint. The calm exterior became a shield rather than a signal. This view resonated strongly with those who believed in the vulnerability of attachment. It offered empathy, it offered explanation, and most importantly, it offered moral clarity through compassion. The second narrative positioned her as an accomplice, neither entirely controlled nor entirely autonomous, but operating within a complex interplay of influence and agency. This interpretation recognized emotional gravity without dismissing personal responsibility. It suggested that human behavior can be shaped by relationships while still remaining accountable for its outcomes. Supporters of this view often spoke of layered motivation, acknowledging that people rarely act from a single psychological impulse. This perspective appealed to those who resist extremes. It allowed nuance. It allowed ambiguity. Yet ambiguity is emotionally demanding, and not all observers are comfortable sustaining it. The third narrative framed her as a strategic actor, someone aware of social perception and capable of navigating it deliberately. In this interpretation, composure was not containment, but calculation. Emotional regulation became evidence of foresight rather than stress. Supporters of this view often pointed to consistency in demeanor as a sign of intentional self-presentation, interpreting calmness as a form of control rather than a response to pressure. This narrative offered certainty through suspicion. It simplified complexity into intention, and simplicity, psychologically, is easier to hold than contradiction. What made these narratives powerful was not only their content, but their emotional utility. Each provided a framework that allowed observers to align the story with their existing beliefs about responsibility, influence, and human nature. The debate became less about facts and more about interpretation. Evidence was filtered through preference. Tone was weighed alongside timeline. The same behaviors serve as confirmation for opposing conclusions because perception does not operate in isolation. It operates through internal frameworks shaped by culture, experience, and bias. Psychologists often note that the human mind seeks resolution, not merely information. Resolution reduces uncertainty. Uncertainty generates tension. When faced with complex cases that resist definitive categorization, observers gravitate toward narratives that restore emotional balance. Some find balance in empathy, others in accountability, others in suspicion. None of these positions are inherently irrational. They are reflections of different psychological priorities. The difficulty arises when the desire for resolution eclipses the acceptance of ambiguity. Experts analyzing such narratives frequently avoid absolute labels because human behavior rarely conforms to binary definitions. Personality exists on spectrums influenced by environment, relationship dynamics, and emotional context. A trait that appears adaptive in one situation may appear destructive in another. Emotional restraint can signify resilience, fatigue, or strategic awareness, depending on interpretation. Attachment can represent devotion or dependency, depending on perspective. The divided narrative, therefore, became part of the story itself. It was no longer only about one individual. It was about how society processes complexity. Debates continued not because new facts constantly emerged, but because existing facts allowed multiple psychological readings. Supporters of each interpretation found reinforcement in the same material, illustrating how confirmation bias operates even in the presence of shared information. The mind does not always seek new data. It seeks alignment with existing belief. And perhaps the most unsettling realization was not that certainty was elusive. It was that certainty might never be attainable. In a culture accustomed to clear verdicts and definitive labels, ambiguity feels unsatisfying. Yet psychological truth often resides in that unsatisfying middle ground where influence and agency coexist, where emotional gravity shapes decisions without entirely determining them, and where perception remains inseparable from interpretation. The divided narrative endured because it mirrored a broader human condition. The need to make sense of behavior that resists simple explanation. And in that resistance, the story found its longevity, not as a single account, but as an ongoing conversation shaped by the minds of those who engaged with it. When public debate reaches its loudest point, another transformation often begins quietly. The psychological shift that occurs when visibility is replaced by confinement. Noise fades. Schedules narrow. Identity, once defined by external interaction, is forced inward. For Karla Homolka, the period of incarceration represented more than physical restriction. It represented a restructuring of daily existence. In environments where routine is imposed rather than chosen, the mind adapts not through grand realizations, but through subtle recalibrations. Time itself changes character. Hours stretch. Days become measured by institutional rhythms rather than personal decisions. Confinement does not only limit movement, it alters perception. In structured environments, predictability becomes both stabilizing and disorienting. The same corridor walked each morning. The same sounds echoing through hallways. The same schedule repeating with mechanical precision. For many individuals, this repetition produces a psychological phenomenon known as institutionalization, the gradual adjustment to external control until it feels normal, even necessary. The mind, seeking equilibrium, learns to operate within boundaries it did not choose. Identity in such spaces becomes layered. There is the identity remembered from before. There is the identity assigned by the institution. And there is the identity negotiated internally in the quiet hours when neither label feels complete. Observers often imagine confinement as static, as if personality freezes behind walls. The reality is more complex. People adapt. Emotional responses shift. Self-perception evolves in response to new limitations and routines. The absence of constant public scrutiny removes one form of pressure, but introduces another, the pressure of introspection. Without the distraction of social performance, the mind turns inward, revisiting memories, reassessing decisions, and searching for coherence. This internal process is rarely visible. It unfolds slowly, without audience or commentary. The public, meanwhile, continues to debate outside those walls. Narratives persist. Opinions circulate. Yet inside confinement, the psychological focus narrows. Daily life becomes defined by immediate surroundings rather than public discourse. The distance between external perception and internal experience widens, creating a dual reality where the person known to society exists alongside the person known only to themselves. Confinement also introduces emotional containment of a different kind. In highly structured environments, visible expression can feel risky or unnecessary. Many individuals adopt emotional moderation not out of calculation, but out of adaptation. The face becomes neutral because neutrality conserves energy. Conversations become measured because predictability reduces tension. Over time, this moderation can resemble detachment to outsiders, even when it functions internally as self-preservation. Psychologically, this stage often brings a reorganization of priorities. What once felt urgent becomes distant. What once felt distant becomes immediate. Simple routines gain significance. Reading, writing, brief conversations, the passage of time marked by small milestones. Identity, once tied to social roles and public perception, begins to orient around internal continuity. The question shifts from how am I seen to how do I remain stable? Stability becomes less about reputation and more about emotional endurance. For observers, this period is difficult to interpret because it lacks spectacle. There are fewer images, fewer statements, fewer visible cues. The narrative slows, and with that slowing comes a loss of clarity for those watching from outside. Yet internally, change can be profound precisely because it is unobserved. The absence of constant evaluation allows psychological processes to unfold without immediate judgment, though not without consequence. The paradox of confinement is that restriction can produce both limitation and transformation. Limitation of movement, transformation of perception. Whether that transformation leads to reflection, resilience, or simply adaptation varies from person to person. What remains constant is the shift in how identity is experienced. It becomes less performative and more introspective, less shaped by external applause or criticism, and more shaped by the quiet need to maintain coherence in an environment where control is minimal. From the outside, confinement appears as a pause. From the inside, it is rarely still. It is a period where identity is rewritten not through dramatic declarations, but through the slow accumulation of internal adjustments that may never be fully visible, yet remain deeply influential in the long arc of a person's psychological journey. When confinement ends, society often imagines a clean transition, a door opening, a step forward, a return to ordinary life. But psychologically, release is rarely a return. It is an entrance into a different kind of scrutiny. For Karla Homolka, the period following incarceration did not unfold in silence. The public narrative, though quieter than before, had not disappeared. Memory lingers in collective consciousness longer than headlines do. And reintegration into society becomes less about physical freedom and more about negotiating the echo of past perception. Reentry introduces a new psychological terrain, one shaped by visibility without spectacle. There are no courtroom cameras, no daily news panels, yet the awareness of recognition persists. A glance that lingers a second too long. A whispered conversation that stops abruptly. The mind learns to interpret subtle cues, measuring spaces not only for safety, but for anonymity. Freedom brings mobility, but mobility carries exposure. Identity at this stage faces a dual challenge. There is the self that seeks continuity, and there is the label that refuses to fade. Sociologists often refer to this as label persistence, the phenomenon in which public identity remains attached long after formal processes conclude. The label becomes a shadow that travels with the individual, influencing interactions even when it is unspoken. People do not always articulate their awareness, but their reactions reveal it. A pause before engagement, a cautious tone, a reluctance to ask questions directly. For the person experiencing reintegration, these reactions can produce a heightened state of self-consciousness. Routine activities, entering a store, walking through a neighborhood, starting a conversation, gain an added layer of internal calculation. The mind balances two competing desires, the wish to blend into ordinary life and the awareness that complete anonymity may never be fully attainable. Yet reintegration is not solely defined by external perception. It is also shaped by internal recalibration. After prolonged confinement, autonomy returns gradually rather than instantly. Decisions that once felt automatic require renewed confidence. Schedules that were once imposed must now be constructed. Freedom demands choice, and choice demands energy. The psychological shift from structured routine to open possibility can be both liberating and disorienting. Stability must be rebuilt through daily habits rather than institutional frameworks. Public memory complicates this rebuilding process. Collective recollection does not operate on the same timeline as individual change. Society remembers in fragments, images, headlines, brief summaries, while personal identity evolves in continuous, often unseen ways. The result is a temporal mismatch. The individual moves forward internally while the external narrative remains anchored to the past. This mismatch creates tension, not always visible, often persistent. Observers may debate the ethics of reintegration from a distance, framing the discussion in terms of justice or forgiveness. But for the individual navigating everyday interactions, the psychological focus is immediate and practical. How to establish routines, how to communicate without triggering recognition, how to maintain equilibrium in spaces where past and present intersect unexpectedly. Over time, adaptation emerges through repetition. Familiar routes are chosen. Social circles narrow or expand cautiously. Identity becomes less about public discourse and more about private continuity. The person learns which environments offer anonymity and which invite scrutiny. This learning is not strategic in a theatrical sense. It is adaptive in a human sense. The instinct to seek spaces where daily life can unfold without constant reference to history. Yet the weight of memory does not disappear entirely. It shifts from headline to undercurrent. For society, reintegration often appears as closure. For the individual, it is a prolonged negotiation between past perception and present intention. The psychological journey is not about erasing history. History resists erasure, but about establishing a present that can exist alongside it without being entirely defined by it. In this stage, identity becomes a balance between visibility and privacy, between acknowledgement and forward movement. The narrative no longer belongs solely to the public, yet it is never entirely private either. It resides in the space where collective memory meets individual continuity. And in that space, reintegration is less a return to normalcy than a gradual construction of a new equilibrium, one shaped not only by freedom, but by the enduring echo of how the past is remembered. Long after timelines are documented and public attention fades, some stories remain active not because new facts emerge, but because the questions surrounding them resist final answers. They linger. They resurface. They refuse to settle into a single conclusion. The narrative surrounding Karla Homolka eventually moved beyond immediate events into a broader ethical conversation, one that extended far past courtrooms and media cycles. People no longer asked only what happened. They asked what responsibility means when psychology, influence, and perception intersect. And this shift transformed the discussion from legal analysis into philosophical debate. Ethical questions endure because they do not belong to one individual. They belong to society. Some observers focused on accountability, emphasizing the importance of personal agency regardless of emotional context. From this perspective, decisions are viewed as choices that carry consequences, and psychological influence does not erase responsibility. This viewpoint prioritizes clarity and structure, offering a framework where moral lines remain visible even in complex situations. Others emphasize the role of influence and emotional environment, suggesting that human behavior cannot always be separated from relational dynamics. In this view, responsibility exists, but it exists within layers of psychological context. The conversation becomes less about absolutes and more about degrees. Degrees of awareness, degrees of autonomy, degrees of emotional pressure. A third perspective examined the ethical dimensions of public judgment itself. How much should perception shape reputation? How long should collective memory define identity? At what point does accountability end and reintegration begin? These questions reveal a deeper psychological truth. Societies seek closure, but closure is often elusive when human behavior defies simple categorization. Ethical debates persist not because people refuse to agree, but because agreement would require reducing complexity to a single narrative. And complexity resists reduction. In these discussions, language itself becomes a battleground. Words such as justice, forgiveness, accountability, and rehabilitation carry emotional weight that extends beyond dictionary definitions. Each word represents a set of values, and each set of values reflects cultural priorities that shift over time. What one generation views as resolution, another may view as unfinished dialogue. The persistence of ethical debate also reflects the human need for coherence. We prefer stories with clear endings. Yet some narratives remain open not by accident, but by nature. Psychologically, unresolved questions continue to occupy mental space because they challenge the frameworks through which people interpret behavior. They invite introspection. They expose biases. They force reconsideration of assumptions that once felt stable. In doing so, they transform individual cases into broader reflections on how societies define morality, responsibility, and change. For the individual at the center, these debates may feel distant or abstract. For the public, however, they serve as mirrors. People project their own beliefs about justice and empathy into the narrative, using it as a lens through which to examine personal values. The conversation becomes less about a single figure and more about collective identity, what a culture believes it stands for, and how it reconciles contradiction. The ethical question, therefore, does not close because it was never solely about events. It is about interpretation. It is about the boundaries of judgment. It is about the tension between certainty and nuance. In the end, the enduring nature of this chapter lies not in definitive answers, but in the recognition that some stories remain active precisely because they compel society to confront its own psychological frameworks. They remind us that morality is not only a legal construct. It is a social dialogue shaped by perception, memory, and evolving values. And perhaps the most revealing aspect of this dialogue is not the disagreement it generates, but the introspection it demands. A quiet acknowledgement that understanding human behavior often requires accepting complexity rather than dissolving it. There is a stage in certain narratives when the individual at the center begins to fade from daily conversation, yet the story itself refuses to disappear. It detaches. It circulates. It becomes something larger than the person it once described. For Karla Homolka, this stage marked the transformation of a lived reality into a cultural memory. Cultural memory does not function like personal recollection. It is selective, symbolic, and shaped by repetition rather than chronology. Details blur, while impressions remain sharp. The mind retains images and phrases more easily than timelines, and over time those fragments harden into myth. Myth, in this sense, does not mean fiction. It means simplification. A complex psychological narrative becomes distilled into a handful of descriptors: calm, controversial, debated. These descriptors travel easily because they require little explanation. They fit into conversations without demanding full context. As they repeat, they gain authority. People who never followed the original events begin to recognize the name through association rather than understanding. Recognition replaces knowledge. This process reveals a fundamental trait of collective cognition. Societies remember stories through emotion more than information. Emotion is efficient. It compresses complexity into feeling. A story remembered emotionally can persist long after factual details fade. This persistence is not necessarily intentional. It is cognitive economy. The brain conserves energy by storing impressions rather than exhaustive data. Over years, impressions transform into cultural shorthand, references that evoke reactions without requiring explanation. In this phase, the narrative becomes a mirror reflecting broader societal themes. Discussions shift from individual behavior to larger questions about perception, responsibility, and identity. The person at the center becomes less visible than the ideas their story represents. It is not erasure, it is abstraction. The individual is still present, but the story now operates independently, circulating through documentaries, articles, and conversations that reinterpret the past through contemporary lenses. Media plays a renewed role here, but differently than before. Earlier, coverage amplified immediacy. Now it amplifies legacy. Documentaries revisit footage. Commentaries reinterpret expressions. Analysts compare past reactions to present attitudes. Each retelling adds a new layer, and with each layer, the original context shifts slightly. The narrative evolves not because the events change, but because the observers change. New generations bring new values, new frameworks, and new emotional priorities. The same story, viewed decades apart, can provoke entirely different conclusions. Psychologically, this evolution demonstrates how memory is not static. It is reconstructed every time it is recalled. For those directly involved, the persistence of cultural memory can feel distant or intrusive, depending on circumstance. For society, however, the story becomes part of a collective archive, a reference point used to examine other cases, other debates, other moments of moral uncertainty. The name no longer belongs solely to its original timeline. It becomes a symbol invoked whenever similar questions arise. Symbols endure because they condense complexity into recognizable form. They are portable. They are adaptable. They are emotionally efficient. Yet this endurance also carries a paradox. The more symbolic a narrative becomes, the less nuanced it appears. The layers that once defined it gradually flatten, leaving behind outlines rather than depth. What remains is not the full psychological journey, but the echo of it. A simplified representation that continues to influence perception long after the details have faded from common awareness. In this stage, the life of the story surpasses the life of the event. It continues to circulate, shaped by those who revisit it rather than those who originally lived it. And in that circulation lies its lasting power. A reminder that certain narratives do not conclude when headlines end. They persist as cultural artifacts, evolving with each retelling, reflecting the values and anxieties of the societies that keep them alive. There comes a final stage in stories like these where the focus shifts entirely away from the individual and lands, quietly but unmistakably, on the observer. The narrative stops asking, "Who was she?" and begins asking, "Why are we still looking?" For Karla Homolka, the enduring nature of the discussion is not only a testament to controversy, it is a testament to human psychology itself. Some stories remain active because they disturb categories we rely on for emotional comfort. They blur the lines between influence and agency, appearance and intention, sympathy and accountability. When those lines blur, the mind cannot settle easily. It returns again and again, searching for resolution that may never arrive. This stage is less about facts and more about introspection. Not personal introspection alone, collective introspection? Why do certain faces remain in memory while others fade? Why do some narratives provoke endless debate while others conclude quickly? The answer often lies in the way a story challenges expectations. Humans construct mental shortcuts to navigate social reality. We expect behavior to align with appearance, emotion to align with morality, and outcomes to follow predictable arcs. When a narrative resists these patterns, it unsettles the very shortcuts we depend on. The discomfort is not only intellectual, it is emotional. Ambiguity demands cognitive effort. It forces the brain to hold multiple possibilities at once, and holding multiple possibilities is mentally taxing. The instinctive response is to simplify, to choose a definitive interpretation and rest within it. Yet some stories refuse simplification. They persist precisely because they do not resolve neatly. They become psychological puzzles without final pieces, and puzzles without final pieces linger longer than completed ones. At this stage, the individual becomes almost secondary. What remains primary is what the narrative reveals about society. It reveals how strongly we rely on visual cues to judge sincerity. It reveals how deeply cultural expectations shape moral interpretation. It reveals how memory transforms complexity into symbol. And perhaps most significantly, it reveals how uncomfortable we are with uncertainty. In conversations years later, people may no longer recall exact timelines or detailed evidence, but they remember how the story made them feel. Unsettled, divided, curious, conflicted. Feeling, not information, becomes the anchor of recollection. The narrative evolves into a mirror through which society examines its own frameworks of justice, empathy, and judgment. This reflection does not produce unanimous conclusions. It produces awareness. Awareness that perception is influenced by bias. Awareness that identity is layered rather than singular. Awareness that moral clarity is sometimes less accessible than we would like to believe. In this final psychological stage, the story ceases to belong solely to history. It becomes a tool for examining the present. People reference it when discussing new cases, new debates, new ethical dilemmas. It functions as a point of comparison, a reminder that human behavior rarely fits into simple binaries. The narrative persists not because it demands attention, but because it continues to offer lessons about perception, responsibility, and the limits of certainty. And perhaps that is why it endures. Not as a headline, not as a verdict, but as a question that lingers in the collective mind long after the immediate events have faded. A quiet invitation to reconsider how we interpret identity, how we assign meaning, and how we confront the uneasy reality that understanding human behavior often requires accepting complexity rather than dissolving it. In the end, the most lasting chapter of such stories is not written about the individual at all. It is written about us, about the ways we watch, remember, and attempt to make sense of the contradictions that reveal as much about our own psychology as they do about anyone else. After debates exhaust themselves and documentaries end, what remains is not always a verdict. Sometimes what remains is silence. Not the absence of conversation, but the quiet space that follows when words can no longer resolve uncertainty. The story, connected to Karla Homolka, ultimately settles into this space. The headlines fade, the panels disperse, the images appear less frequently, yet the psychological imprint does not vanish entirely. It lingers in cultural memory like an echo that grows softer but never completely disappears. And in that echo lies the final lesson of narratives that resist closure. Silence is uncomfortable for societies that prefer clear endings. We are conditioned to expect resolution. We are taught that every story should conclude with certainty. But certainty is not always available when human behavior intersects with perception, influence, and emotion. The silence that follows prolonged debate is not emptiness. It is recognition. The quiet acknowledgement that complexity has limits beyond which definitive answers cannot easily pass. In this recognition, the focus shifts from judgment to reflection. Over time, the name becomes less a subject of immediate conversation and more a reference point. It surfaces in discussions about perception, about moral ambiguity, about the ways public memory shapes identity long after events have concluded. The individual recedes, yet the questions persist, resurfacing whenever similar dilemmas arise in new contexts. The narrative no longer demands attention, but it remains accessible, waiting in the collective archive of cultural memory. What this silence reveals is not indifference. It reveals acceptance of nuance, acceptance that people are layered, acceptance that perception is imperfect, acceptance that responsibility and influence can coexist in ways that defy simple categorization. For the observer, this stage invites a different kind of engagement, not with facts or timelines, but with introspection. It asks the viewer to consider how easily impressions are formed, how strongly expectations shape interpretation, and how quickly repetition transforms fragments into belief. In this way, the story becomes less about a single figure and more about the psychology of observation itself. The final chapter of such narratives is rarely written with dramatic language. It is written with restraint. Restraint acknowledges that understanding does not always arrive as a conclusion. Sometimes it arrives as awareness, the realization that complexity is not a flaw in a story, but a reflection of reality. Human lives are not linear scripts. They are evolving sequences influenced by environment, relationships, and perception. When a narrative exposes this truth, it leaves behind more than controversy. It leaves behind perspective. And perspective, unlike headlines, endures quietly. In the end, the silence after the argument is not a void. It is a space where certainty gives way to contemplation, where judgment softens into inquiry, where the story transitions from public spectacle to private reflection. It is there, in that quiet space, that the lasting impact of the narrative resides, not as a definitive answer, but as a reminder that the human mind seeks clarity even when clarity is elusive, and that sometimes the most honest conclusion is the acknowledgement that not every question was meant to close completely.